I just want to introduce our next session. So some of the themes that we heard Chair Mallory talk about, we're going to pick up a part of that and dig into it by exploring a case study on how to build a national coalition to help ensure that the benefits of nature-based solutions and nature goals are shared equitably. So I want to invite up two dear friends to the stage, Teresa Martinez and Angel Pena, who both have dedicated their careers to making sure that nature is accessible to all people. And they are also both a part of a new national effort called America the Beautiful for All Coalition. Welcome, Angel and Teresa.
Thanks, Luis. Good morning, everyone. My name is Teresa Martinez. And along with being the executive director of the Continental Divide Trail Coalition, I'm also a privileged partner or member of the advisory board for the Salazar Center, so it's an honor to be here. And my good friend Angel Pena is joining me today, and colleague, friend, and co-conspirator. We get into a lot of trouble together, and good trouble.
And we have fun.
Only good trouble, maybe. That's related.
Yeah, that's Raptor, yeah.
But it's a pleasure to be here and talk about the work that we're doing with America the Beautiful, the For All Coalition, and how sort of that helps implement the Biden administration's vision for 30 by 30, and how I am involved partly through my work at CDTC, but also as the chair of the board for the Next 100 Coalition, is that with the Continental Divide Trail in particular, we see that this not as a recreational resource. Yes, people can hike from Mexico to Canada from along the trail, but it's really a connector of landscapes, communities, and cultures. It's a 1.98 million acre, congressionally designated national scenic trail that has specific requirements to protect the nationally significant natural, cultural, scenic, and historic resources along that corridor. So from Mexico to Canada, along the major watershed of the North American continent that provides 180 million people water, we have a congressionally designated corridor that is also there to ensure that we, as humans, have a direct connection, an intimate experience with that landscape. And the reason for that isn't just for the recreation, it's because these are places where life emerges. It's water. There's nothing more important on this planet than water. We can't survive without it. And so the fact that we have a congressionally designated corridor that connects across 5 states from the Mexican border to the Canadian border through New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. And of course, artificially, there's a border, but the Continental Divide goes all the way north and all the way south, connecting us across international landscapes. We have this opportunity to talk about community-led conservation, protection, and in places where humans have had, since time immemorial, connection to this landscape. And today we have a way of working together to look forward in how we continue to ensure the national significance of this landscape exists for not just our generation, but 8 generations forward. And so in that space, that's how we show up with the America the Beautiful Coalition, seeing ourselves as sort of a stitch in this larger landscape across the North American continent, as well as across the United States. And with that, one of the other things I'll mention is we work in community and partnership, and that's how Angel and I really work together, is the work that he does with Nuestra Tierra conservation project, as well as part of the backbone team for the America Beautiful Coalition. And for that, I'll turn it over to Angel.
Thank you, Ms. Teresa. Buenos dias, everybody. My name is Angel Damian Soto Pena. I am first the father of 3 crazy kiddos. My 15-year-old, she just had her first date like 2-3 weeks ago on a Saturday, and then she dumped him on a Tuesday. So we're doing just fine. And my middle kid, her name is Isabella. She's got crazy energy and the biggest curls. Those folks with curly hair, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. A lot of energy, just busting out. And then my 5-year-old little boy, nothing but a lover and just the best little human ever. And then I am the privileged executive director of the Nuestra Tierra Conservation Project, where the team and I wake up every day to ensure that deliberately, historically excluded communities, not only do we have access to the outdoors, but that we have access to the public land management process. And we do this in co-conspiration with great partners like the CDTC, and we do this through education, advocacy, and good old people power. And then I am the proud member of the America the Beautiful for All backbone team that was really born out of an idea an idea that conservation is the consequence of the deliberate and authentic cultivation of community. And also the president told us to, so that was helpful. But this is when, a few of us, just about 2 years ago now, worked to pull together leaders from across the country of both geographically and ethnically diverse backgrounds to ensure that any solution that came forward was going to be rooted in lived and learned experience, because that is the answer and that we're all looking for. This is when we were able to find leaders from Califas to Maryland and from Hawaii to Alaska to really take on the largest conservation goal of this century, really driven by our twin goals. One, to conserve at least 30% of land and water and ocean by 2030, to avoid massive species loss, while implementing a Justice 40 metric to make sure that the America the Beautiful initiative investments of at least 40% are headed straight to the ground, straight to frontline communities, straight to the folks who have everything to lose. And we want to make sure above and beyond anything, that Justice 40 isn't just a buzzword for philanthropy or for those in the DC Beltway, but that we really are hitting the ground in the most meaningful and authentic and community-driven way. And so excited to dive into this work with you all.
So maybe one of the things I'll share as a part of the steering committee for the America the Beautiful for All is that it really is rooted in relationship. And when we talk about community, what does that mean? It means relationships. So yes, there's science, and yes, there's solutions.
Science.
Yeah.
That thing.
Science is a whole complex thing, especially when you're working with communities of color that is steeped in white supremacy. So it's an important component, but it's not how you lead when you're building relationships. You lead with community. And a lot of times for our work, the way we show up, and I think one of the benefits of being in the steering committee space is knowing that oftentimes the communities, especially frontline communities that have often been overlooked, already have the solutions they need. They've just never been invested in, or they get a one-time injection of funds and then the funder goes away.
Absolutely.
And so some of the work we've been doing with America the Beautiful has been to really uplift and start not just talking about how do we solve these problems, but doing the work to break down the systems that have kept our communities out of these conversations and out of the solutions long term. And so with that, I don't know, Angel, if we want to talk about some of the successes that we've had with America the Beautiful. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think you're right on. It's really the idea that we're rooted in community and we're prioritizing the cultivation of trust so that we can lean into that trust and have hard and real conversations. And public lands and waters are often seen as a defining feature of our shared heritage and culture. But since day one, have been accessible to most. And since day one, the 21st century conservation movement has been rooted in inequities, racism, and stolen lands. And so I think coming to that and building off of that foundation and being able to have that amazing trust with one another is a big win that I don't want us to forget about. It took time to get to a policy agenda, but that was most exciting and one of the things I'm most proud of. And bringing together the collective power of nearly 150 work groups and steering committee members, organizations, and hundreds of frontline organizations, indigenous communities of color, legacy conservation groups, hunters and anglers, public health nonprofits, businesses, private lands, land trusts, and others in our broader community to lead and ask the questions that are really defining what the largest conservation goal of this century could and should look like. And then, we developed a policy agenda that we launched on the anniversary of the Biden administration's commitment to America the Beautiful and 30 by 30. And I tell you what, between friends here, pulling together 1,000 people from different issues and sectors to say, yes, these are going to be our top 20 policies that we're going to power forward in a community. What's the right word for it? Was crazy. Yeah, that's a good word for it. But cannot
we
be.
did it.
We absolutely did, and we're about to launch our second policy agenda, and that's all the good stuff. But the great stuff is really that time we took to build relationship with one another.
Yeah, one of the questions that just came up was, how did this how did this happen, and then like, who's funding it? Well, we have to say, like, there's definitely funders. Doris Duke, I think you're in the room. Some funding from Doris Duke, Hewlett. I can't think of, you probably know all these.
Well,
But-
a vision without resources is little more than a hallucination. And so we did go to our legacy group friends, the big greens, the folks with 40, 50, 60 million dollar budgets,
Yeah.
to say, hey, we're not going to be tokenized. We frontline organizations, frontline communities, but rather this is our crazy idea and we need you to support us. And then that's when I think the large foundations started to jump in. And great question. And we still need funding to those in the room.
Throwing that out there.
Yeah, throwing that out there. Yeah.
Well, and I think the other piece of that is, I think one of the things you said was that, we started to ask questions, but we also started to challenge the system and how we were doing the work. And I think that was one of the first relational pieces, is working with legacy groups to say, hey, we want you here, but this needs to be led differently. We need to show up differently. If we keep throwing the same solutions at the same walls, we're going to get the same results. And we need to be different again. So not just talking about it in a room at a conference, but actually getting knee deep and having those uncomfortable conversations around a table, over weekends, on the phone, on a lot of Zoom calls, to sort of get to where we needed to flex different muscles to be able to show up in relationship and community differently than we had. And also on the responsibility of communities and organizations and efforts that aren't typically at the table, they do things differently. They're not wise to the world of sitting in a room around a table. They sit around and drink a lot of coffee and talk about things in their backyards, around picnics, with familia, with culture, with a whole different space. So when we show up in those spaces, we do that too now. And I think it has really reshaped how we have conversations, how more we can show up in authentic ways to actually say what needs to be said and name what needs to be named, and be okay with it. It makes us uncomfortable. Because I think so often in these conversations with America, like what we've learned, especially in conservation, is that we stay in the lane that's safe. And we don't talk about, like, I know one of the things we wanted to talk about is while we have this great success with America the Beautiful, we're also recognizing that the Biden administration's goal for like renewable energy is still putting the big onerous on the same communities that are struggling with oil and gas. So now instead of having oil and gas installations and infrastructure, they're gonna have solar panels and wind towers and all these other things, so they're not winning at all. And they're just like, hey, we're getting the crap again, and you promised us that we weren't. And so now everybody, no offense to people in Boulder, but everyone in Boulder is gonna have green energy, but me in Lordsburg, I'm gonna have 2 million solar panels across a wide open landscape that right now is not developed. You may see it as a wasteland. I see it as my home where my DNA comes from. And I think that's the difference of the conversations that we're having, is bringing in this human component that isn't around the ego of human, it's around the fact that we come from these places. These are time immemorial, in some cases, relationships to these places, which is why we're fighting so hard to protect them. My DNA comes from southern New Mexico.
Mine too.
Yeah, and it's like oozing right now, and it fires me up, and it tells me that I'm not just doing my work even along the CDT because I believe in the landscape. I'm doing it because my family and my ancestors come from that place. And that connection makes us as a community want to fight in a different way. I still want to bring in science. I still want to bring in all these partners. But at the end of the day, it's because I'm fighting for home. And it's a home that's defined differently. And I think for too long, these communities, or the conservation movement has been rooted in very beautiful things up here that are very idealistic, but the reality shows up so differently. And that has been left out of the conversation because it's uncomfortable, and it's messy, and it's sticky, and it's sometimes you have to face some really harsh realities about white supremacist culture in our world in general, much less in the conservation space, which is why I think when we think about the challenges of America the Beautiful, unrooting and unpacking that human component is such a big thing. And so we still are successful. We were able to get to that policy agenda because we started naming those things and saying, we don't have to solve the problem, but we need to talk about it, and we'll eventually figure it out.
Yeah, no.
Sorry, I went on a rant, but.
No. Yeah, right? Totally. Absolutely. No, I think that point is solid too, that we must not sacrifice the communities that we continue to sacrifice. And leaning into this discomfort and these dynamics can also be fun in addition to heavy. And we have an opportunity to really redefine the 21st century of conservation to ensure that it's not all about the charismatic flora and fauna, but making sure that we are empowering communities in real and meaningful ways. And then my last piece that I just wanted to share, yes, it's amazing how we have public health organizations, we have frontline organizations, indigenous leadership, and legacy groups, but we put up some guardrails pretty early on. And so I think we're more powerful when we take things on with the capital C community, a little bit of all of us. But we did say only 3 legacy groups, for example, are allowed to be on the steering committee out of the 17. And the 14 of the rest need to be rooted in community and be a frontline organization that is led by a person of color or those people who have and had everything to lose since time immemorial. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So actually, that brings up one of the questions. There's so many great questions here. I'm not sure where to go. Let's go back to the policy agenda. Want to talk about that process, and I think that'll also uproot how we're actually structured as a coalition, because I think the policy agenda came about because of the structure. So I don't know if you want to talk about the structure and how then we move through the policy agenda iterations.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was over 150 organizations from across issue base that were taking on and leading these working groups, taking everything on from private lands to public lands, oceans, waters, urban parks and green spaces. And it was out of that very diverse and dynamic group of leaders that then we put the world of possibilities on a chopping board. And then we worked backwards. We took the time to check in with frontline organizations and then was able to develop and identify those policies that are not only cross-cutting, but that are rooted in the communities that have been deliberately and historically excluded from day one. And we were able to do this because we asked and appropriately poked the bear there in the green groups, that they had to sit back and that they needed and they needed to stand down and support and let it be okay that perhaps the Kastner Range, only because it was going to be 7,000 acres of protection, but it was rooted in community, and it was rooted in the stories of that place. And so it was a little bit, I think, uncomfortable for the larger groups, but it provided us with a solution that is going to withstand the political landscape, because success for us is not the end of this Congress or the end of this administration, but success for us is 2030. And we really don't care what your favorite color is, red or blue, because the solutions that we're putting forward are ones that are going to be long-lasting and founded in frontline folks. Yeah.
And I think one of the other things I'll add, just based on, I think some of the questions come in, I would say that we're rooted in concentric circles. So there's the backbone team, which is handling all the, one of the biggest challenges when you work in a coalition, I'm sure many of you have done this, is somebody actually has to schedule the meetings. Someone actually has to do the travel plan. Someone actually has to do all that really fun stuff. And so the backbone team, which is made up of Green Latinos, TWS, Nuestra, Tierra.
And then the Children Environmental Health Network.
That's right. They kind of handle all of that. And then the steering committee, which is a group of 17 from across all these different industries, so to speak, we are sort of the thought partner in that space, the big thing. And then we have, is it 6 working groups?
Yes, ma'am.
And ma'am.
Yeah, Teresa. Yeah. Did you guys know she was also a downhill mountain biker and a swim
Not a
coach?
downhill one, just a regular
She's pretty
one.
cool, guys. Pretty awesome.
I was a state champion of Virginia in 1987.
Details.
Or 97, I don't remember. It's a long time ago. Anyway, the Working groups then have, I mean, they can range from like 15 to 20 people per working group. So there's like these concentric circles, and then there's a larger ally community and accomplice community. I know some of the questions are like, what about my organization? Can I join? I don't think we're quite there yet. I think we're starting to figure out what that next iteration of engagement is, whether you're tribal partners or anybody other kind of organization. You know, it's a complex machine. It's still in the system. You know, we still live within the system that we're poking every day. I have a good friend who's a tribal leader, and she said, you know, you want to poke the bear, you just can't get eaten by the bear when you're doing it. So, you know, there's that whole thing around making sure we're being smart and being very methodical and thoughtful and human, while at the same time very, very cognizant that we're a cog within a wheel within the system. And so I would say, like, we have a website, americathebeautiful.org, and you can always see what's happening there. We're getting ready, actually, next week to be in DC to pull together all of the leaders, particularly the priority campaigns working group and the steering committee and the backbone team, to basically start doing that strategic visioning around what comes next. So it is a work in progress, and I would say the work is moving, but it's complicated, just like everything else, because there's all these, I mean, we weren't even sure we were going to do the thing next week because of the government shutdown.
Oh,
so
yeah, that thing. Yeah.
there was that whole thing, but because, you know, the government. But I would say that, like, the way it's structured is it's still deeply human. And I know we keep coming up with the words community. Luis, if you were to count how many times we said human and community, I don't know, it'd be thousands. Because it is really rooted in the human experience and at what we're learning together. I mean, this has never been done before, right? So there's no roadmap, there's no guide. We can't go to like Google and be like, how do you build this kind of coalition? It doesn't exist. We're creating that Google playbook right now. And so we're trying to be very thoughtful. It hasn't been perfect, but I think one of the strengths is that we come back to the check-in of how are we doing and what does that relationship look like. And I will say something too, because I think it's an important component. The tribal investment and the role that tribal organizations, tribal nations, individuals have played in the coalition have completely shaped the work. And it's unfortunate that one of them couldn't be here. I know they're also equally very busy, but I think the lens of that being the first step versus the last step, or, oh yeah, we forgot about.
Let's have that DEI conversation at the end of the conference, right? Whoops, we almost forgot. Yeah, totally.
No, it's rooted first. And so that means that it shows up differently too. So even within the structure and all the other things, it's just constantly learning or creating a new playbook, I should say. We're co-creating every day.
Totally, and we prioritize connection before content in every meeting, to do that check-in, to do that slowing down, and to make that virtual eye contact as best as possible, so that we are always working on our relationship with one another. So we have that space to ask those hard questions and redefine what success and the process could look like.
So one of the other questions coming up is, where was it? What about climate change? How are we addressing climate change? And I think it's not a stand-up. I would start the question or answer, and maybe you'll respond, which is more that it's just embedded in everything we do. It's not like a separate other than or second to. It is just part of, I mean, obviously the reason we're doing this, 30 by 30, is rooted in the fact that our climate is changing. And we need to protect land in order to ensure that we have the resources to survive as humans on this planet. So it's almost embedded in every single component. It's just embedded in a different way because we're talking about public health. We're talking about, you know, different components that I think oftentimes in conservation we're not rooted in these broader conversations. So.
Yeah, no, and I do, because there's philanthropy in the room, making real eye contact with a couple folks. But, you know, I know, especially in that world, sometimes I know my organization is almost forced to think of climate change and biodiversity as two separate issues. But we at the coalition, I think, really took it on as the opportunity to get creative and look at them in one and the same, and can't have one without the other. And so very excited to make sure that climate change is embedded in just about everything. And, you know, sometimes with the folks whose favorite color can be read. We just don't talk about climate change, but changing growing seasons really resonates in the reality of that. And so really looking at it as an opportunity to dive into some cool stuff together.
Yeah, we were in DC back in the early summer, late spring, and we were meeting with USDA, and we had a young man from the Pena Nation, and he's a farmer. And he was very rudely talking to the Secretary of Agriculture, or the Undersecretary of Agriculture, and talking about like how it shows up on his personal family's farm. And I think when you talk about climate change, like we work with the community, at CDTC we work with communities from southern New Mexico to northern Montana, and particularly in Hidalgo County, which is the Boot Heel of New Mexico, which is a part of the northern Chihuahuan Sky Islands province. It's also one of the most biologically rich landscapes on the entire planet, much less North American continent. But when you go there, you don't think it is. It looks brown. But when you dig deep, there is layers upon layers of biodiversity, also because it's in a critical transition zone between Sky Island, Sierra Madres, and the Rocky Mountains, and the desert to the upper plains of the Gila. And it's a critical migration corridor for every kind of bird species. I think there's 500 species of songbirds, much less the potential for jaguar. There's also this thing called a border wall down there. And actually right at the CDT is the only place there is no wall on the southern border. And it's a 6-strand barbed wire fence, and the potential now for jaguars and other large megafauna to come through on the east inside part of the boot heel is high because of the lack of a barrier to their progress and movement. So when we look in these places, when you talk to the ranchers who've been ranching there for 100 years, or you talk to some of the other families, they'll tell you climate change is real, and they vote as red as they come. Because they know, they live it, they feel it, and their kids don't want to be there anymore. And they want their kids to stay home and be part of this legacy that they've had. So when we talk about climate change or the work we do, it's just it's not other than, or biodiversity isn't other than, we know it because we live it, we see it. And I think that's sometimes the challenge in a lot of the work that we do, which is what we're trying to break down with America the Beautiful, is having these silos of conversations when you're talking to real people who are living the day. I mean, if you have cattle out in the boot heel of New Mexico, you know where the water is or where it isn't. You know when the water isn't showing up. You know when it's not raining. You know what the issues are. And so to think that they're not thinking that way is a big challenge to how we look at conservation. And it starts the conversation off wrong from the start, because their whole livelihoods are dependent upon the environment and nature. It's not separate to what they do. It is part of every single facet of their lives. And I think that's what we're trying to elevate when it comes to climate change and the way we're addressing it within our policy agenda. It's just a given. Yes, the climate is changing. And so whether it's a small farm or a large ranch, or where we're putting renewables, or where we're putting oil and gas, because it's still a thing, we can tell ourselves it's not, but it's still happening. How are we going to do that in a way that's sustainable? And what we're not talking about, which I think is part of our policy, maybe next iterations, are like, how do we just reduce what we're using? Like, we talk about all these solutions to renewables and more solar panels and more wind towers and all the things, but we're not talking about, what if you just only had one phone, one computer, one TV? You know, why do we have to have a TV in every room? And because it demands power. Like, that's the issue. We're not willing to give up anything, but we're thinking we're going to solve a climate crisis. You know, and we can go down that path, and I think that's sort of where we're starting to get to these really sort of like mirror-like questions of like, what am I going to do in my daily basis? And I admittedly will say, I drove up here from Santa Fe, where I live, in my car, my gas car, and I'll drive home tonight. So I'm part of it, you know, but it's important to be here. So then you have to do this sort of gyration of like, how do we resolve this in a meaningful way? And that's when it gets messy, because none of us are perfect. And science can't solve that. I'm sorry.
Magic's the next thing.
It's lean into the magic. I don't know. It happens somehow. Let's see. I know we only have 1 minute left. They're not screaming yet, or 2 minutes? Okay. I don't know, maybe closing words.
Yeah, I guess when it comes to America the Beautiful for All table-to-table coalition that we built together in community, we were in D.C. a couple months ago, and it made me think of this book that I'm currently reading, JFK's Nation of Immigrants. And in the book, he talks about his inaugural speech, and it was really powerful. In his inaugural speech, he talks about how him winning the presidency was a signal that the country was handing over the baton to the next generation of leaders and business owners and farm workers. And when I look at those pictures from our fly-in, I get that. You know, I see the next generation. I see that the status quo, the old conservation community, is some of them reluctantly, but they are all working to hand over the baton to the next generation of leaders. And so I heard there was an amazing conversation at lunch yesterday, and very excited to empower and elevate and amplify the vision of the next generation of folks so that we can it can't stop at 2030, right? It's got to keep powering forward. And that's one of the things that I'm most proud of and excited about when it comes to the America the Beautiful for All coalition.
And then I will just piggyback on that as a way of closing. And it's not just up to the next generation. I think that we do this job of like, it's all on you all. You can save us. No, we got to do this work together. And so how do we bring intergenerationally across racial, ethnic diversity, across age generation diversity, and do this work together? Because I think that's the beauty of America the Beautiful. It isn't just us or them, it's a we. We have those solutions. And so getting beyond the conversations and the uncomfortableness and the offended remarks and moving into where we can just be human and be like, you know what, let's just work through that and then we'll get to the next thing. So I would just say it's up to us together, and I think that's what I'm most proud of about the America the Beautiful Coalition and being a part of this sort of effort to reimagine conservation for the not just 21st but 22nd century, and ensuring that we have a place to continue to thrive and exist as human beings. So thanks.
Whoop, 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 whoop.